Welcome to episode 13 of the Die Human podcast, where I'm joined once again by my wonderful wife, Kelly, here on a Saturday evening in rainy Scranton, Pennsylvania, to discuss her and our experiences with miscarriage in our pilgrimage and family life. So thank you, Kelly, for being here to talk on this rainy evening.
You're welcome.
Well, as you know, we've been building more and more caskets for families who experienced loss of a baby in utero. Been doing this for 15 years. And
I think the first casket you ever built was for a baby that we lost in utero.
It was long before I ever thought about making caskets as a way of providing for our family. Back in 2003. We did. We experienced the loss of our baby in the first trimester. And, well, that's a good place to start. I remember, I think I was sitting on the couch in our house on Vashon Island, and you came out of the bathroom and said that, I think that you first just told me that you were having some bleeding issues. Like had this would have been our third child. And, it was early on, maybe 8 weeks or so into the pregnancy. Do you remember?
Around 8 weeks that I started bleeding, but I hadn't, with my first two pregnancies, I had very terrible morning sickness. And with this pregnancy, I didn't have morning sickness. So I was feeling a little uncertain that it was progressing. And I guess my feelings were correct.
Yeah. So you had a sense that maybe something wasn't quite right even before then.
Yeah, I felt like if I was pregnant, I should feel more pregnant.
Yeah. And it's kind of raw to think about, but I remember like you when you actually had the miscarriage, you held the baby's remains in your hands.
In the palm of my hand. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it was like, oh, we're confronted with something here. You know, we'd had our daughter and our son, and this pregnancy had ended, but we were confronted with a situation. We were on this island. We weren't really a big part of the parish community yet. We had some friends in the parish. Our pastor was a very intellectual man who was not super pastoral necessarily, at least not with our family or where we were at that time. So we didn't call the church and say, what should we do and how can you help us or anything like that. We just built a little casket, and we had some friends over that we'd gotten to know in the couple years that we'd been there, and we had read some verses from the Bible, and we sprinkled some holy water on the ground, and we laid that little body in the ground. So you were not Catholic yet when that happened. Do you remember? I mean, as you said, you'd struggled. Your pregnancies have not been easy.
I think you're wrong. I think I was Catholic at that point. Hadn't I just come into the church that shortly before that happened?
Had you just come into the church?
I think I had. I think it was right after.
Oh, maybe so.
Yeah, because I remember thinking, well, this baby, and it was my first, what we would call planned pregnancy, because my first two children, I was still under the impression that you could. That if you tried to control things enough, you could plan your pregnancies.
Well,
I wasn't Catholic with our first two children, so I was still trying to plan my pregnancies, but things didn't really go as planned, and so that was part of what made it easier for me to embrace the church's teaching on sexuality, was that I realized how harmful it was for me to think that I could plan everything, that the best laid plans can go awry, and that it can actually end up being better than anything you'd ever planned. So I remember thinking when we lost that baby that I gave that baby something the other babies hadn't had, which was the Eucharist.
Wow. Well, I'm chastened because now that I look back on it, yes, of course, and especially, your attitude toward that loss, and you're looking to Scripture for solace and for understanding, and just the way that little ceremony that we had went. Of course, that's true. You're right. So
Yeah, and I was trying to, sort out what God might be trying to teach me through that, because, it was the first pregnancy that I really embraced from the start. And then to have it end, I was like, okay, I guess God's really trying to drive home the message that it's not about my plans.
yeah. And okay, so you were Catholic. So did you feel that we didn't even really consider like going to the church with that for any sort of like liturgical rite that would follow, as far as, and we were kind of isolated on the island as far as where we lived and everything too, but there was no direction, and I don't even really know that there is any direction now. I think there's a little bit more awareness in the church than there was 22 years ago, that we need to acknowledge and help families along who are experiencing this loss.
Well,
But
I know that I had run across people talking about, if you suffer the loss of a child in utero, you can still name that child. So you're not just talking about the baby or the pregnancy or whatever. You can actually give that child a name. But I don't know that we had heard much about people burying, about funerals for.
no, and I mean that was pretty. So 2003. I mean, you had considered yourself pro-choice like 3 years before that, 4 years before that. So you also recognized that tension as somebody whose eyes had been opened to the value of human life beginning at conception. I mean, within your friend group and even just your own recent sort of like, I almost want to say indoctrination or conditioning about how to think of a human life as like kind of a non-person until he or she is born. Everybody struggles with a little bit of loneliness, I think, and grief in a culture, and hidden grief, I should say, in a culture, unacknowledged grief in a culture that has this weird schizophrenia about whether you care enough about the baby or not. That's when it becomes a real human being or
Right.
not. So I think that was a big moment for you too when you lost that baby. I mean, you had already begun to see. I mean, you already understood and articulated that life begins at conception. But
Well, and actually, I would say before I became Catholic, even once I was out of high school and had gone to college and had learned something about embryology, it becomes pretty hard to argue that that's not a person. So I remained pro-choice through college, but I would say that it is a person from conception, and that when a life is intentionally ended through abortion, it is like murder in self-defense, because that's why women often make that choice, is because they feel threatened by the pregnancy, the same way you would feel threatened by an intruder in your house. So I felt that, we do allow people to defend themselves by taking another life. So I saw it as similar to that. And so I would have acknowledged the loss of life. But yes, I did feel that how it was handled depended on the mother's feelings,
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah.
yeah. So do you feel like that galvanized you when you had a miscarriage in a new way, or not? You were already kind of where you were intellectually and emotionally before that actually happened, before you experienced that?
I think it really helped me understand how unhelpful I had been to women in crisis pregnancies in the past. I kind of had an experience with a friend who became pregnant shortly after high school, and it was not a planned pregnancy. And I remember she had a miscarriage, and I was just like, well, yay,
Now you don't have to get an
that's
abortion.
great. Now you don't
you
have
don't have to-
anything to worry about. And she just started weeping, and I was like, oh, what did I say?
There's something more here that I'm not getting.
Yeah. So I didn't really get it, but I realized that I'd really said the wrong thing. And I just kind of held that, like, hey, what happened there? And so then when I had the experience myself, it was a little bit of an aha moment. Okay, now
Like-
now I get how it feels.
Yeah. So
yeah.
even beyond the mind into like there's a whole bodily experience. Like there's a whole
There's a physiological
re-
experience.
yeah.
There's also hormonal changes that happen, and then you go through the stages of grief. There's anger and denial and bargaining and all of that. Even with the loss of a pregnancy very early on,
Yeah.
even a pregnancy that perhaps at the time was not desired, and women who have abortions actually grieve the loss of their child.
Yeah, and to
a
a lot
lot
of
of the time.
And to a lot of people, that feels like if somebody's callous, they'll be like, "Well, it's your fault, so you don't get to grieve." But
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
no, we're just more complex than that. We can do the wrong thing and suffer for it. Like that's, in fact, we kind of do always. But yeah, like that's something you're right that needs to maybe have more attention paid to it. And I guess like there's like the Rachel Vineyard Healing Ministry that does try to allow women the space to grieve
Yes.
because.
Very important ministry.
And especially if most people are feeling, even if they wouldn't have said it out loud like you did, that like, yes, how can I not acknowledge it? This is an actual human life that I'm taking, but I'm doing it in self-defense. And then learning later that like, not only was your life not threatened, but you might have severed a lifeline that God was sending you.
Yeah.
So then,
Yeah, it could have been the greatest blessing you'd ever experienced, and you rejected it. Yeah, that's a very hard thing to come to terms with, but not something that can't be forgiven.
no.
In fact, all of us who kind of grew up in the post Roe v. Wade era are pretty quick to forgive that, because we all grew up with the same mentality. We understand.
Yes. And even if we were pretty convinced of the pro-life argument and the sacredness of all human life, we all had friends or family that, was responsible for, directly or indirectly, involved in an abortion because desperate times require desperate measures. And you don't have, and really we failed to create this sort of cultural superstructure even within the church that is willing to sacrifice and suffer to come alongside people, not just give lip service to. So there is an argument. There is an argument that pro-choicers have that, that not that you only care about a baby until it's born, but like, yes, it is hard to offer genuine help, resource-wise, time-wise, money-wise, over an extended period of time versus just like, we'll come alongside and we'll help you. And this is one of the things actually that I'm really proud of being a part of here with the Providence Pregnancy Center next door is this is an organization that's come, sprung up since we've been here that we're helping to support and helping to do some of the building for and everything with, yes, articulating and defending the sacredness of human life, and then also offering material resources, financial resources, clothes, diapers, those kinds of things. Yes. And then housing also for moms in crisis while they're experiencing their pregnancy. And then afterwards for a year and for other children they might have. And then a food bank is coming out of that. So, trying to take that whole picture and really, color in
Not
all
even
the
just
aspects
caring
of it.
for the mother and her baby, but caring for the entire community.
That's a
I
really
think
good
I've heard somewhere it takes a village to raise a child. So yes, you have to
Interesting.
help the entire village then, don't you?
So thank you, Hillary Clinton, for saying something useful to the pro-life argument. Yeah,
So
for real.
it's through that ministry, the Providence Pregnancy Center, that you've been able to set up the Rose Fund.
That's right. Yeah. So Mary's Rose Fund, the Rose Fund was started after a family who's lost their baby girl Rose. gave us some money to say, can you help other people? Because we'd been giving caskets to families who'd experienced miscarriage or the loss of a child, infants, toddlers, young adults, in all sorts of ways. So yeah, when they donated that money to us, we set a fund aside, and then we started a nonprofit fund also, you're right, with the PPC, the Providence Pregnancy Center, so that we would have more resources to provide more caskets, whether it's early term.
So people can
Pregnancy.
make a donation to Marian Casket's Rose Fund through the Providence Pregnancy
Yeah.
Center.
Yeah.
And then makes us more able to provide caskets to more families
Right.
who've lost a child.
And it gives the Providence Pregnancy Center yet another facet of the support that they're providing, because sometimes people do suffer that loss, and it's great to be able to come. Even somebody in a crisis pregnancy could still
They still
find
grieve.
themselves in that grief
Yeah.
state. And the more we can come alongside mothers, especially in this hidden grief of miscarriage, and love them and acknowledge it, and have the church do that, more so. And I know that there's lots of churches that have ministries and that will have masses when a mom has a miscarriage, when a family loses the baby, they'll have a mass so they can acknowledge that life. There's a lot of Catholic cemeteries in the country now that set aside space that they offer for free to families experiencing that loss.
So when I had my first miscarriage, I didn't know really about any of those. We just
No.
had our, one other family at the parish who was, had more than 3 children.
Yeah, they were kind of our
yes. So they
authorities.
were our support through that. But yeah, I've now become aware of a lot more, resources, a lot more that you can do to support grieving families. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about, some of the things people can say to a woman who's experienced the loss of a pregnancy, some things that are helpful and some things that are maybe not so helpful. I mean, obviously saying, that's great.
That's about as far on the one side of the spectrum as you can go.
I was way off with that response. And most people, even pro-choice people, know that that's not a proper response. But I think it was probably about 16 when that happened. But there's still quite a few responses that you hear from people who are trying to console you. They recognize the loss, but they don't necessarily know what to say. And I would say the most common one that we heard was just, there was probably something wrong with the baby. So, next time hopefully you'll have a healthy baby.
Yeah, although we already had 2 children, so we
Yeah.
didn't get the next time that much from family and things
Yeah,
either.
yeah.
It was kind of,
That's true.
That's interesting. Am I stepping on the cord and lowering the microphone?
You
It's
are.
like a magic trick. Let's make sure that I didn't pull that out.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
working.
So yes, you do hear that from a lot of people that you can try again, especially if it's a first or second child, you can try again. There must be something
And it
wrong.
is consoling if you've already got children, you can put some of that maternal energy toward them. But if you haven't had a child yet, it's your first child that you've lost, then a lot of time all that energy doesn't have anywhere to go, and you don't know whether you'll ever be able to have a child. So yeah, saying, well, it's okay, you'll be able to have another one, really isn't consoling, because we all kind of know, especially if you know anything at all about biology, that each child is unique.
Right.
You were prepared to greet and love that child just the same way you would any child. So the loss is still
It's very individual.
It's the loss of a unique individual
Yeah.
who will never be replicated.
Yeah, and a lot of times people will say, especially if it's early on, and there's an understandable thing with you have more of an emotional attachment in some ways. It's hard not to. The longer you spend with someone, the more attached you become. But that first one was eight weeks when we lost that baby, and then you had a second miscarriage 10 years later, and it was like 17 weeks in.
Second trimester, yeah.
So, as far as, well, when you had, we are a lot farther along with thinking about what this meant to our family. All of our other children were more used to this being apart. You had the sickness that you didn't have with the first child,
Yeah,
so you suffered a
there had
lot.
been
You
more
sacrificed.
Sacrifice. Yeah, I had spent months in bed, being ill during the pregnancy, and then I was confronted with the feeling of relief, physical relief, that the pregnancy was over.
Because you really had a hard pregnancy.
Because it's so, yeah, there's
How
a
is
lot
that
of suffering
for
involved.
you as a mom to feel relieved amidst something that is making you super sad? Like that, I mean, not feeling relieved as far as mentally or emotionally, but like your body, you actually have
my
a physiological
physical relief.
relief.
Yeah, it wasn't too hard to separate that. I mean, as a rational human being, I didn't feel too guilty for feeling relieved, because it's really hard for me to be pregnant. It's hard for anyone to be pregnant, but it's true, especially for some women. So no, I didn't have any guilt, but it was just sort of a strange, surreal feeling.
Yeah.
The feeling of loss and yeah, and trying to not feel like I had wasted all that sacrifice. Trusting God that no love is ever wasted, no matter what the outcome might be.
Did you feel that physical relief kind of instantly, like as soon as, because this
yeah.
wasn't like a quick thing. This was tough. Like you started to bleed and you lost the
Yes.
baby, so you knew that you're having a miscarriage.
It was a dangerous miscarriage.
Yeah,
So
we were
yeah,
at our house.
My water broke. My midwife said you should probably go to the hospital, because sometimes, rarely, people hemorrhage during miscarriages. So we went ahead and we went to the hospital. And the baby was delivered there, just a little tiny handful, maybe just, I don't know, 5 or 6 inches long. And
Little boy.
yep, little boy, far enough along to know it was a little boy. And then I started bleeding, and we kept saying to the, nurses in the waiting area, I think this seems like this is a lot of blood. This doesn't seem really normal. I've had other children and I didn't bleed this much, even with a full-term pregnancy. This is a lot more blood.
Because it was hours. It was
Yeah, we
just
were
going
waiting
on
and waiting
on
and waiting
on.
for hours and hours at the emergency room. And then finally I lost consciousness.
Yeah, we were
Yeah.
we were in a room by that point.
Yeah, a waiting room though.
No,
still,
you.
but
Yeah, you were
not,
lying
not
down.
in a. Yeah, it was in.
Right, you hadn't been admitted to a room.
Yeah.
Right, you were in one of those like curtained off areas of the emergency room, and we were there for hours. And a nurse would come in, and it wasn't always the same nurse, and they're changing things out and whatever. And and then your vitals. I was there. Your vitals plummeted. Your eyes started to roll back in your head, and I said, "Help." And they came in and they put 2 bags of saline solution into your bloodstream to bring your blood pressure back up. Mm-hmm. You said goodbye, basically.
I said, "Here I go," because I thought that's it. I know what this is. I can feel the blood leaving my fingertips and my toes, and it's all going to my viscera. This is, and then I went into shock, and I could feel my body. I could feel a seizure. But I couldn't open my eyes. Couldn't tell if I was breathing or not. I was trying to breathe, but I couldn't tell if I was breathing. I could still hear, but I couldn't see anything because the room was flooded with the white light, like people describe at the end of their lives who've had near-death experiences. So yeah, I saw the bright white light.
Saw the bright white light. You could hear like that there was commotion in the room.
I could hear what people were saying, yeah, but I couldn't respond.
It went from, we lost our baby, this is hard, to, I just remember going, no.
Yeah, I remember thinking, this is so stupid.
Yeah.
I came to the
We're at the
hospital to avoid this, and I'm gonna die here in the waiting for help. But then, we they gave me the IV, and that brought my blood pressure up enough that I regained consciousness, and they moved me into the operating room for an emergency D&C, which is, the same type of procedure that a woman goes through when she has a abortion. But thankfully, the doctor who did that with us, he was evangelical.
We prayed over you. We read the Bible
Christian,
passage.
yeah,
And that was very
prayed
consoling.
with us
The
as
St.
we went
Joseph's
in.
Hospital. So
Yeah.
I'm glad. There wasn't. There were not by that point a lot of indications that it was a Catholic hospital. So,
But
having
then we did ask them if we could keep the body, and they were kind of like, yeah, the midwife told us you might want to do that. We'll look into it. We'll see. But before we left for the operating room, we just wrapped the baby in some gauze.
I stole the baby's
we
body.
stole him and put him in my purse.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't. It
Which-
didn't feel right to leave him there.
Yeah, and that could sound really strange that like you wrap up a little baby's body and you take it out of the hospital, but it was so clear that we couldn't just allow this little human to go into like whatever medical waste pipeline.
Yeah.
It was usually was what they were, their standard procedure.
Right. And I later learned, and it's probably different for each state, but I later learned that, there are regulations as far as the government says that if the baby's past a certain gestation, that it has to be handled as human remains
So a funeral home
rather
has to
than
be
just
involved.
medical waste. So, yeah, you have to contact a funeral home and have a death certificate and all that if you want to take a baby that's in Washington. I think it's past 24 weeks or something like that.
So that's state by state.
Yeah, but the different states have different regulations. So, yeah, I thought that was interesting that like you might not be able to take your preemie, your miscarried child home with you because it's a human, but you can end the pregnancy. And if it happens at an abortion clinic, it's medical waste. But if it happens at the hospital, it has to be handled by a funeral director.
There's no shortage of contradiction
Yeah.
when it comes to unborn human
Yeah,
life.
so different states, you'd have to, explore what the requirements were.
Yeah, that's something that would be not bad for the church to actually provide to families to have that at least like within the Respect Life committees or the grief committees, so
Yeah,
that people could
anybody-
know that there was somebody who had that answer, so that if they knew that was going on within the parish, they
Yeah.
could come alongside. And
Yeah,
help
that is
person.
information that parishes should have.
Yeah, because that process of then I built another casket for that baby Stanislaus, as we named him. Yesterday was the feast of Saint Stanislaus. Then we had more children then, and they were more aware and everything, and we did basically the same thing. Because again, though I'd been building caskets, we'd had this ministry for a few years by then. We didn't. There wasn't anything like at our parish that said, here's what you do. That's for sure. I don't know if there is now. I don't think there is. So we should probably talk to them about that the next time we visit. But it was very helpful to our family, to our children, I think, to have a continuation, like have something more happen after the loss of that baby. Okay, baby's body, we're going to lay this baby's body to rest. They're aware of it, as opposed to just mommy was pregnant, she was in bed, she was sick, she was unavailable.
And they were pulling together to help for the baby.
They were. They were siblings. Mm-hmm. They are siblings. So, because that made me think when you were talking about the Rose Fund and how people started to give us some donations toward providing this ministry. That one of the things that was really beautiful, I got a 4-page letter from the mom who lost baby Rose, and she sent me pictures of their 4 children, with 3 or 4 children. I can't remember actually. With the casket and everything, and the digging of the baby's grave, because they lived in Alaska, and they had this land that they were on, and so she sent me also a 4-page letter that just talked about how important this was for their family to go through the grieving process together, to acknowledge it, to acknowledge the physical reality, the spiritual reality. So, because I think
the siblings to have some sort of outlet for the sense of loss that they have.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it really does speak to, like, a lot of times in matters of death, we we don't know what we don't have as far as the healing that's available, that the church avails to us, because it's just not a part of our life. And so much now, the funeral homes have kind of taken the terrain of death away from the church. The church used to be the authority on death, like back in the early church. Obviously, especially when Christians were being martyred for their faith, the church was the authority. And, communities were the ones who buried their dead. And then same thing with communities when furniture makers were building coffins, in the early part of this country's history. But there was much more of a community effort, and the church was at the head of it. And now, the funeral homes have kind of said, "Don't worry, we'll do everything for you. We'll ease that burden for you." But easing that burden, so often, as we know in life, it means actually taking away the healing, because it's the lifting of the burden that gives us the strength that is part of the healing process. So I'm thinking about how that kind of thing is when we give that authority and that expertise to somebody outside of the church, we really do interfere with what is God's ordained way of, coming together as the body of Christ to acknowledge the life that's here, the life that's entrusted to Him, and to, I don't know, properly. There's just a very organic way that we've dealt with death until, I don't know what, money or expertise, just division of labor,
People talk about
dissolution of communities.
The Civil War being kind of the beginning of
that's
the
true
modern
with
funeral industry.
Right, because that's when
a lot of young people were killed.
People
in
were killed
battle, that
far
they were
away,
far from home, so they
right.
had to
Embalming
ship the
started
bodies.
happening, and
so families were no longer handling the bodies of the deceased.
right,
They were being handled in
by
places
professionals who had the skills and the equipment or whatever to do these kinds of things. So in a lot of ways, then, so losing a child during pregnancy is like a lot. It's a lot simpler, because you don't necessarily need to bring all this stuff in. So maybe it brings us into an intimacy with death that God has allowed, an order of dealing with death that is how it has been throughout most of human history.
And
that
maybe
when families deal that
part
way.
of the reason we have a difficulty dealing with the death of a preborn child is because
unfamiliar.
of the abortion mentality, because we have to tell ourselves that it's not really a child. And in fact, I had people say that to me who were offended that we had buried our child. They said, "Well, you guys talk about it as if it's like a real baby."
Okay.
So that's not a good thing to say.
So here's actually a tremendous opportunity to witness to human personhood in utero, right? Because that's pretty callous.
Yeah.
And not too many people say that, but some people do
Some
say
people
that.
do.
And so, but most people, and people even like we were on a very hippie island, and a very left-leaning island, a very sexual revolution spawn type of mentality on the island. But your loss, your sadness, like, women wanted to still be kind to you, because they wanted to be, they believed in a sisterhood. They believed in a consoling you in your grief. So in some ways, not excluding the person and the people that you talked about there who were callous, there were other people who would have been very pro-choice, said, we support, a woman's choice to do whatever the woman wants to do, who then came along and consoled you,
And shared their own stories of loss.
it opened
Yeah.
them up in a way that was non-threatening, because it wasn't a polemic political argument about pro-choice and pro-life and where does life begin and all the stuff that's wrapped up in that and control, but rather it was just your sad and your sadness, and your acknowledgement of your sadness is actually opening me up to acknowledge my own sadness that maybe I didn't in the past. And I think that that's a really huge opportunity for the church to have a strong pro-life witness in a way that isn't combative or confrontational. It's just a work of mercy. And then that, without pointing fingers and without an argument, that gives other women maybe who have a different point of view, or other people who maybe have a different point of view, to consider out of empathy things that they might not consider
Yeah.
argumentatively.
They're witnessing a corporal work of mercy. And it is a corporal work of mercy that has been condemned by oppressive governments in the past, and not just, burying infants, but burying people, right? Didn't the Romans prohibit burial? That's why the catacombs exist, right? Because it was an affront.
That's
to
an
the
excellent point.
Romans.
Yeah, or cremation was done to try to deny
the
that the body has any
resurrection.
value, or
Yeah.
certainly the resurrection. And even pre-Christian civilizations, to say like the body is not who we are, the body is of no value. And obviously it just stands in total opposition to what Christ came to show us with his incarnation. And what we're more and more even scientifically understanding, I think, which is just how the body and the mind and the soul, the body and the mind and the spirit are all interconnected, and like violence done to one, or suppression or repression done to one, can express itself in other areas. Like just an unhealthy spiritual life can actually affect our health physically and things. So it's interesting to see just how incarnational reality and spiritual reality are getting more and more difficult to separate if you're paying attention.
Those corporal bodily works of mercy affect the spirit.
Yeah, and the spiritual works of mercy affect the body. Yeah. Well, thanks for talking about this, because I know that there's just tons of people whose grief is hidden, or who don't know what to do. That's got to be a big part of that. Needs to be a big part of what we do, is not just providing caskets for families who've lost a baby in miscarriage, but also helping parishes, funeral homes, and cemeteries to have a clear healing path for families who are going through that trial.
That would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there are sometimes when there's a pregnancy that ends very early. Like we've had that experience before too, where a pregnancy ended really the week after we found out, so probably around 5 weeks, and there were no remains. So what does a person do in those circumstances?
That's more of a spiritual work of mercy, I would say, than a corporal work of mercy. Yeah. And that was an interesting time too, because that was during COVID, and my mom had just died. And we found out you were pregnant when we were on our way to my mom's funeral.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So we were actually en route. We were in Idaho on our way from Washington to Pennsylvania. And it was like, whoa, we got all the family together, and we were almost never together at that point because the oldest child was off at college. And so we all came together, and we all were traveling together. And then it was like, well, I was going to say, it was like, do we even tell people? Because we're in the midst of going to...
We didn't want to pull attention away from grieving the loss of your mother.
Yeah.
We needed to process that a little bit before we processed the pregnancy emotionally. But
we did, though. I think we told when we got to Pennsylvania. I think we shared it.
We did with your brother, but I don't know if we had talked to the kids about it. I can't remember.
But they
would remember.
So when you're asking what do you do in that situation, like that was a very poignant and pointed situation, because it was like we're saying goodbye to my mom and saying hello to another baby at this point in life amidst all this. Like, I was 52 and you were like 33. No, you were 46,
46.
you know, and so, but what it was hope. It was like a spark of hope. So what we did is we
still gave that child a name.
Sparky.
Sparky, that's Sparky.
Yeah, because amidst the sadness and the grief, it was a reminder that life goes on. And then when we lost the baby, very, like you say, shortly after even realizing you were pregnant, it was like, okay, trust that baby to God. We just trusted my mom to God. And just again, like this, the light, the spark, the hope.
Yep, I thought about, I kind of envisioned a campfire and a little spark
Really?
going up into the air.
Still got some of that hippie in you, don't you?
I do. I was raised by hippies. What can I say?
Yeah. I don't think your mom considers herself a hippie or your dad. They skipped Woodstock.
Well, yeah, they were getting married the weekend of Woodstock, so they were busy.
Yeah. That was a better choice, I think. Okay. Yeah, so what you do is you acknowledge the spiritual reality that that God has brought another life into existence that you've cooperated with, and then there's mystery in it, and you got comfortable with mystery.
And we still include that child in our intercessory prayers.
Yes, we ask
at bedtime.
We ask for our children's intercession. So that's more life awaiting us. You know, more life to get to know more intimately. And again, there's a lot of mystery in that. As far as I know, that there's some people who have very, I think, pretty succinct ideas about what awaits them as far as when they lose a baby in miscarriage. I don't. I just know that God has surprised me with wonderful things over and over again in this life, and
no love is ever wasted.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So let every man toss off his full wonder, and let every man drink of his full glass. We'll drink and be jolly and drown melancholy, singing here's to good health to his true-hearted lass. We'll rant and